Not exactly, but also not entirely false. Let's get into it. Hello there and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Chinsia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. So as we just saw, I saw this very old TikTok of a young lady responding to the idea that the Trojan War never happened. And it's filled with lots of people in the comment section going, actually it did happen, it's a historical event, it's not all like that, and everyone's wrong and everyone's partially right at the same time. So I thought I'd do a video debunking this. Now, I'm kind of an oldie, I don't really understand TikTok at all, and people have asked me to do more debunking. I can't find them. If you know of any, please tell me down below, give me some links, I'm all appreciative. But for now, we're going to talk about very briefly the Trojan War. Did it happen, did it not happen, etc. So as you can see from the video TikTok that we just watched, this young lady came to the revelation that, you know, she'd always thought her whole life up until the age of 22 that the Trojan War was a real thing, which I find rather odd, which kind of surprised me in a sense that I never thought anyone would take it literally, in a sense that I'm not sure how one comes to know of the Trojan War without knowing of the very fantastical mythological elements that made it famous. You know, the concept of Achilles, this great warrior who was completely invincible bar from his ankle, or rather his heel as well, but more of the ankle, but sometimes also the torso. All because, you know, he was dipped into the river Styx by his mother, or he was actually treated with the ambrosia by his mother, who then burned away his mortality in the hearth fire. Again, though, she held him by the ankle, so that's where the weakness comes. You know, the legends surrounding the Trojan War are inherently mythological, and I would argue that the legendary mythology is actually what makes the Trojan War a common conception amongst people who haven't read the poem. To me, a person knowing of the Trojan War and believing it historically accurate in a way that's completely detached from any mythological surroundings or magical surroundings is beyond me. It would be... To me, it's very similar to the idea that someone believes that King Arthur was a king, and yet doesn't associate King Arthur with very obvious fantastical mythological elements. The sword of Excalibur, the Lady of the Lake, or, you know, Merlin. The idea that they're disconnected from the fantastical mythology is kind of beyond me. However, let's cut to the chase. Does this mean that the Trojan War actually did happen? Well, actually, it's quite complicated. All we know is that whatever happened in the late Bronze Age before its collapse did not happen in the same way mythology has memorialized it. But the Trojan War motif is important. It's more than just a backdrop for epic poetry. For the ancient Greeks, it formed one of the focal landmarks of their history, and it served the same purpose later for the Romans, who traced their origins from Aeneas, a Trojan warrior who survived and built a homeland elsewhere. And the same goes for the Goths and the Franks. But what do we actually know about Troy? Well, for starters, we know that there is a real place, known to the Greeks of the early first millennium, as Ilios, or Ilion, hence the name Iliad, which means the poem of Ilion. And it was likely, actually, that this Ilios place was the same place that was known to the Hittites in the late 2nd century millennium, and Wilusa is actually known today as Hisarlik in Turkey. Now, Hisarlik has undergone numerous excavations, and archaeological evidence has suggested it was the site of a city, or perhaps a small principality that flourished from approximately 2,000 years to 3,000 years BCE to the end of the 2nd millennium. However, in a paper by Easton, Hawken, Sherratt and Sherratt, yes, there are two Sherratts, they emphasise that the site of Troy has the misfortune to stand on not one, but two academic fault lines, one on either side of the Aegean. The Homeric problem that was concerned with the historicity of the Iliad, and the problem of the Anatolian historical geography of the Azawa lands, as reconstructible or not from the Hittite texts. So both topics have been known to provoke strong emotions from those involved, and anyone working with Troy will have difficulty keeping clear of the other discussion, and vice versa. So for those unfamiliar, the Hittites were a powerful civilization that controlled most of Anatolia in the 2nd millennium BCE. Their language, written in cuneiform script or on clay tablets, something which I actually discussed in a video on the history of ancient libraries if you're curious, and many of these tablets were recovered and deciphered in the first decades of the 20th century. But scholars are still wrestling with the problem of placing the cities and countries named in the ancient texts onto modern maps. In an article written for archaeology.org, Hawkins, same Hawkins I mentioned earlier, explains how, according to the text from the 13th and 14th centuries BCE, Wilusa was the remotest Arzawa land and lay on the coast of western Anatolia. But the kingdom of Arzawa was a threat to the Hittites throughout most of the 14th century BCE. There's a long letter from the Hittite king, probably Hattusili III, who ruled circa 1267 to 1237 BCE, to the king of Ahiyawa, and in this letter he mentions that Wilusa was once a bone of contention between the two of them. So there's a relevant passage in Gary Beckman's translation, which I will obviously read out to you. Obviously it's a bit fragmented, so bear with me, I'll pop it on screen. So it starts, I, the Hittite king, want you to send this message to Piramaradu. The king of Hatti has persuaded me, i.e. the Ahiyawan king, about the matter of Wilusa, concerning which he and I were hostile to one another, and we have made peace now. Now hostility is not appropriate between us. Send that to him. And concerning the matter of Wilusa, about which we were hostile, because we have made peace, what then? If a certain ally confesses an offence before his ally, because he confesses the offence before his ally, he does not reject him, because I have confessed my offence before my brother, and let it no further to my brother. Very fragmented, it doesn't really make sense. However, it kind of does, from people who are far smarter than me, who have deciphered it. So, first of all, don't ask me where Ahiyawa was, because that's a contentious issue amongst archaeologists. No one really knows, but all they can agree on is that the known geography of Western Anatolia makes it clear that there was no room on the mainland for the kingdom of Ahiyawa, so it's very likely that it was maybe off an island somewhere. But what is important to note is that Wilusa, identified with the archaeological site of Troy, was a point of conflict between the Hittites and the Ahiyawa. And this conflict is believed to serve as a background for Homeric scholars researching the origin and tradition of the Achaean attack of the Ilios. Thus, if we were transposing this history onto mythology, Homer's Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks, would be the historical Ahiyawans, and the Homer's Trojans were the Hittites, though some theories actually suggest they were other way round. So let's go with the first theory. The first theory makes sense because in the decades after 1200, the Bronze Age collapse, many Hittite centres were abandoned or destroyed, including the capital, Hattusa, and the empire disappeared except for a remnant in the southeast, which is very similar to Trojans. But what is interesting about this idea of the myth and the history is that we have to focus on something. If the Trojans were the Hittites and the Greeks were the Ahiyawans, then the aggressors of the war weren't actually those who lived in the city of Troy, but rather those who lived outside of it. See, if we go back to the Hittite king's letter, he says that they, the Hittites themselves, were the aggressors towards the Ahiyawans, i.e. the Achaean Greeks, and they were aggressors over Wilusa, i.e. Troy. Thus, Wilusa, the Ilium city, and the city of Troy weren't the source of the conflict, but the cause of the conflict. But how severe the conflict was, nobody knows. You see, as we saw in the letter, the Hittite king calls it a dispute, but there's no mention of a war. So if you're a bit confused, let's keep you on track. Troy has multiple names in this conversation: Ilios, Ilion, Wilusa, and Hisarlik, the last one being its name today. For ease of going forward in the rest of the video, I'm going to refer to it as Troy and Wilusa. Troy will serve as its literary reference and Wilusa its archaeological/historical reference, but remember, they're one of the same for this discussion. Thus, as you can tell, it's far too complicated to say that there wasn't a Trojan War, or there was. There's no consensus. However, whilst the Trojan War as we know it from the epic poem is mythological, there's evidence suggesting that the poem memorialises conflict that took place in the late Bronze Age. So, what was Wilusa's relationship with the Hittites? Well, the Hittite Empire was built out of a combination of military force and one-sided treaties, and they had a treaty with the king Alexikoua of Wilusa, which formally incorporated Wilusa within the Hittite realm as a vassal state. This treaty took place during what is known as Troy the 6H, which was circa 1300 to 1200 BCE. Now, I'm not sure who made this or not, but I want to give a huge shout out to the blog Kiwi Hellenist, who created this handy timeline, as you can see on the screen, about the Trojan War. So thank you for making it. I'm obviously linking all the resources down below, and I found their blog post incredibly useful when researching it, so highly recommend it. I've followed it already. I'm now a subscriber to this blog. What's interesting, and what the Kiwi Hellenist points out, the treaty references Apolluna, a god associated with Troy, Wilusa, and this god is very likely linked to the Greek god Apollo, who, if you've read the Iliad, is the most important god favouring the Trojans in the epic poem. Now, I found a translation of this treaty, so I'll link that down below if you're curious to read it. But the god is mentioned at the very end of the treaty from what I can see in this translation. It's kind of like a sealing off to the god, done and dusted in the witness of. However, this link with their god and the Greek god Apollo serves as the strongest link between Homer and the Bronze Age idea of Troy. There are other names that are referenced here and there between academics, but all the names that link them between the Bronze Age Troy and the epic poem are tenuous and contested, to say the least. What else do we know about Wilusa? What happened to it? Well, archaeological evidence shows that the citadel of Wilusa, or Troy, was destroyed by fire circa 1190 to 1180 BCE. Now, one potential cause of the fire is human agency, which could obviously potentially mean military hostilities, but there's no proof that it was definitely caused by human agency, and even if it was, we don't have any evidence to know who started the fire. So it's a possible cause for war, but nothing concrete. And the fire didn't wipe out the city. It continued to be inhabited for another 250 years. So, if it wasn't a major event, why would a Greek poet in the 7th century want to memorialise a 500-year-old story that wasn't about the Greek? Well, that's because Homer made it about the Greeks. It wasn't about ancient history, it was about the Greeks' current period. I mean, for starters, we can see that Homer's Trojans are barely Anatolian. The vast majority of his characters are given Greek names, bar exceptions of Priam, Paris, Dardanus, and Assaracus. What's more important to realise is the context in which Homer was writing. You see, at that time, Greece had begun to colonise Wilusa in the mid-1700s BCE. So at the time Homer was writing, Wilusa would have been very ethnically mixed, and not with Hittites, but Leligians, Maeonians, Mysians, and Phrygians, making the site a perfect source of inspiration for a legend about ethnic conflict and how the Greeks won in the end, which is befitting considering they were the new colonisers to the area. There is a lot of research about the archaeology and relevancy of the Trojan site. I've linked a load of interesting articles down below. There's so many interesting articles about this. Obviously, many of them are through academic journals and they're behind a paywall unless you have access to it through your academic institution or you have a subscription. So I've linked everything I resourced. So I've linked everything that I've mentioned and touched on down below, including some more accessible things that aren't behind the paywall and part of an academic journal, but I think the blog posts are very well constructed. If you know of any other, TikTok kind of conspiracy or historical theories or any ancient history conspiracy theories in general, please let me know down below. I'm very conscious that I do want to do a video series on Atlantis, but I'm hyper aware that someone that I very much admire, Liv, who does Let's Talk About Myths Baby, she's actually doing a series on Atlantis over on a podcast. I don't want that collide. I haven't listened to it purposely because I do want to do my own series on Atlantis and I don't want to kind of accidentally consume some of her media, but if you are interested in that, I will be doing a video series, but I, in the meantime, recommend you go over and listen to Liv over at Myths Baby, and maybe in a while after it's settled down I may make a video series about Atlantis, but I don't want to step on her toes because I really respect her work and I realise that a lot of our concepts actually collide. So if there's anything you'd like me to debunk in the meantime, please mention it down below or link me to some TikToks that you found whilst perusing the internet, and I will see you on Thursday for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.